November 7th, 2024. A quiet Thursday morning in Owatonna, Minnesota, about 65 miles south of Minneapolis. An elderly man, 84 years old, opened his front door to find law enforcement officers standing on his porch. Jon Keith Miller had lived a seemingly ordinary life in this small Minnesota town for decades. A retired man, a father, a grandfather. But the moment he saw the detectives, according to investigators, he knew exactly why they were there. As soon as he opened the door, he knew. Dunn County Sheriff Kevin Bigd would later tell reporters. After 5 decades of silence, after 50 years of believing his secret was buried as deep as the snowbank where he'd tried to hide his victim's body, Jon Miller's past had finally caught up with him. The victim was Mary Kay Schlais. She was 25 years old in February 1974, a brilliant artist, an accomplished equestrian, a University of Minnesota graduate with dreams of attending art school in Chicago. She was hitchhiking along a Wisconsin highway when Jon Miller picked her up, propositioned her for sex, and when she refused, stabbed her more than a dozen times with a knife he kept hidden in his car. He tried to conceal her body in a snowbank along the roadside, but when another car drove past and the driver stared at him, Miller panicked and fled, leaving Mary's body at a wooded intersection in Springbrook Township, Wisconsin. For 50 years, Mary Kay Schlais's murder remained unsolved. Her family mourned without answers. Investigators pursued hundreds of leads that went nowhere. At one point, they even exhumed Mary's body in 2009 and briefly suspected Randall Woodfield, a former Green Bay Packers draft pick who became known as the I-5 killer, before ruling him out. The case went cold, filed away with thousands of other unsolved homicides that haunt families and detectives alike. But in 2024, everything changed. Thanks to a partnership between the Dunn County Sheriff's Office and genetic genealogy students at Ramapo College in New Jersey, investigators finally identified their suspect through DNA found on a stocking cap left at the crime scene 50 years earlier. When confronted with the evidence, Miller confessed. On March 27, 2025, at the age of 84, Jon Miller was sentenced to life in prison for a murder he committed when Mary Kay Schlais was just starting her journey toward an art career that would never be. This is the story of Mary Kay Schlais, a young woman whose life was stolen on a snowy February morning in 1974. It's the story of a family who waited half a century for justice. It's the story of how hitchhiking, once a common and accepted form of travel in the 1970s America, turned deadly for one brilliant artist. And it's the story of how cutting-edge DNA technology and the dedication of college students solved a case that had stumped professional investigators for 5 decades. Before we dive into this 50-year investigation, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This case involves genetic genealogy breakthroughs, a shocking confession from an 84-year-old killer, and the crucial role that college students played in solving a murder that occurred before they were even born. Where are you watching from today? Whether you're in Wisconsin, where Mary died, Minnesota, where her killer lived freely for 5 decades, or anywhere else in the world, this case reminds us that justice has no expiration date. Drop a comment below. Let's honor Mary Kay Schlais's memory together. And if you're watching this late at night like I was when researching this case, what time is it where you are? There's something about these cold cases that hits differently in the quiet hours, when you realize that for 50 years, a killer slept peacefully while a family suffered. Now, let's go back to February 1974, to a time when hitchhiking was common, when young people trusted strangers to give them rides, and when Mary Kay Schlais set out on what should have been a simple trip to Chicago. Una was you other. Mary Catherine Schlais was born on November 4th, 1948, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, into a family that valued education, creativity, and independence. She was the daughter of hardworking parents who encouraged their children to pursue their passions, and Mary's passion was art. From an early age, she showed a natural talent for visual expression, painting, drawing, sculpture. But Mary wasn't just creative. She was also brilliant academically, the kind of student who excelled at everything she attempted. Growing up in Minneapolis during the 1950s and 1960s, Mary witnessed profound social changes sweeping across America. The Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war protests, the feminist movement, the counterculture revolution, all of these influenced the young people of Mary's generation, encouraging them to question authority, to seek independence, to forge their own paths. Mary embraced these ideals. She was independent, self-sufficient, and determined to make her own way in the world. Mary graduated from high school in Minneapolis and enrolled at the University of Minnesota, where she pursued a degree in art. The University of Minnesota in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a vibrant, creative environment, filled with students exploring new forms of artistic expression. Mary thrived there. She studied painting, sculpture, art history, and various techniques that would shape her artistic voice. Her professors recognized her talent and dedication. Her fellow students admired her work and her quiet confidence. She was exceptionally talented, Sheriff Kevin Bigd would later say, 50 years after Mary's death. She had such a bright future ahead of her. In addition to her art, Mary had another passion: horses. She was an accomplished equestrian who spent countless hours riding and caring for horses. This love of animals and nature informed her artistic work, which often featured natural themes and organic forms. Mary found peace and inspiration in the outdoors, in the rhythm of horseback riding, in the connection between human and animal. Mary graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in art, and by early 1974, at the age of 25, she was actively pursuing her dream of attending graduate school to further develop her artistic skills. She had her sights set on the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, one of the premier art schools in the United States. In February 1974, there was an art show in Chicago that Mary wanted to attend, both to see the work being exhibited and to make connections in the Chicago art community as she prepared to apply to graduate programs. The problem was transportation. In 1974, not everyone owned a car, and long-distance travel for young people often meant either taking a bus, taking a train, or hitchhiking. Hitchhiking was far more common and socially acceptable in the 1970s than it is today. It was seen as an economical, adventurous way to travel, especially among young people. College students, artists, musicians, and wanderers regularly stood by the side of highways with their thumbs out, trusting that someone would stop and give them a ride to their destination. Mary Kay Schlais decided to hitchhike from Minneapolis to Chicago for the art show. It was a journey of approximately 400 miles, depending on the route. She would head south and east through Wisconsin, eventually making her way to Illinois and into Chicago. In 1974, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable plan. Thousands of young people hitchhiked safely across America every day. It was part of the culture, part of the freedom that defined that generation. What Mary didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that one of the drivers who would stop to pick her up was a predator. Mary's younger brother, Donald Schlais, would later remember his sister with profound love and admiration. She had earned an art degree from the University of Minnesota and was in the process of applying to graduate school, Donald told reporters in 2024 after Jon Miller's arrest. She loved horses and horseback riding. She was talented, independent, and she had so much ahead of her. On February 15, 1974, Mary Kay Schlais gathered her belongings, likely packed a small bag, and set out from Minneapolis, heading toward Highway 94, the major interstate that would take her through Wisconsin and eventually to Chicago. She stood by the side of the road, her thumb out, waiting for someone to stop. She had no way of knowing that the next car to pull over would be driven by a man who kept a knife hidden inside it, a man who would proposition her for sex, and when she refused, would stab her to death and leave her body in the snow. Before we continue with what happened next, I want to ask, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below, whether you're in Wisconsin, Minnesota, or anywhere else. Mary's story is a reminder of how vulnerable we can be when we trust strangers. Hit that like button if you believe every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. The morning of February 15, 1974 was cold in western Wisconsin. Snow covered the ground and the temperature hovered around freezing. The landscape along Highway 94 and the surrounding rural roads was typical of Wisconsin in winter. Dense forests of oak and pine, open fields blanketed in white, small towns scattered along the highway, and long stretches of isolated road where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. Mary Kay Schlais was hitchhiking along one of these roads, heading toward Chicago. At some point, we don't know exactly when or where, a car pulled over. The driver was Jon Keith Miller, a man in his mid-30s at the time, driving through Wisconsin for reasons that have never been fully explained. Miller would later tell investigators that he'd been adopted as a child, a detail that would prove crucial in the investigation 50 years later. Miller stopped his car and offered Mary a ride. She accepted, climbing into the passenger seat, grateful for the lift. Hitchhiking etiquette in the 1970s was simple. The driver helps the hitchhiker get closer to their destination, and in exchange, the hitchhiker provides company and conversation for the drive. Most rides were uneventful and safe, but this ride would end in murder. According to Miller's own confession in 2024, after picking Mary up, he drove for a while before propositioning her for sexual contact. The exact words he used, the exact nature of his proposition, haven't been made public, but the intent was clear. Miller wanted sex from this young woman he'd just met. Mary said no. For most people, that would have been the end of it. A rejection is uncomfortable but not catastrophic. Miller could have simply continued driving Mary toward her destination, or he could have pulled over and let her out to find another ride. But Jon Miller wasn't most people. He had a knife hidden in his car, a weapon he'd brought with him deliberately, suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd considered violence. When Mary refused his sexual advances, Miller became enraged. He grabbed the knife and stabbed her in the back. The autopsy would later reveal that Mary Kay Schlais was stabbed more than a dozen times. The wounds weren't confined to a single area. They covered her back, her sides, suggesting that Miller attacked her repeatedly, violently, in a frenzy of rage. Mary tried to defend herself. The medical examiner found defensive wounds on her hands, indicating she'd raised her arms to try to block the knife, to fight off her attacker. But she was trapped in a moving car with a man who outweighed her, overpowered her, and was armed with a deadly weapon. Mary didn't have a chance. Miller later told investigators that after stabbing Mary, he pulled off the highway onto a rural road in the township of Spring Brook, Dunn County, Wisconsin, approximately 75 miles east of Minneapolis. This was a remote, wooded area with scattered homes and long stretches of isolated roadway. Miller intended to hide Mary's body where it wouldn't be found. He dragged her body from the car and tried to conceal it in a snowbank along the side of the road. The snow was deep enough to partially cover a body, and Miller likely thought that by the time anyone found her, he would be long gone, impossible to trace. But as he was attempting to hide the body, another car drove past. The driver of that car was a local resident named Denny Anderson. As Anderson drove by, he saw a man standing near what appeared to be a body in the snow. The two men made eye contact. Denny said when he went by, the guy was just staring at him. Mary Dodge, Anderson's neighbor, would later recall. He said he'll never forget the look on his face. Jon Miller panicked. He abandoned his attempt to hide Mary's body, got back in his car, and fled the scene. Denny Anderson immediately knew something was wrong and alerted authorities. When law enforcement arrived at the intersection of County Road M and 410th Avenue in Springbrook Township, they found Mary Kay Schlais lying dead in the snow. She was fully clothed, wearing winter attire appropriate for hitchhiking in February. Her body showed obvious signs of violence, multiple stab wounds, blood soaking through her clothing and staining the snow around her. Near her body, investigators found a crucial piece of evidence: a stocking cap, a knitted winter hat that apparently didn't belong to Mary. The medical examiner, Dr. T.J. Zaleski, performed an autopsy and determined that Mary had died from multiple stab wounds. She had been stabbed more than 12 times, with wounds penetrating her back, sides, and chest. The defensive wounds on her hands indicated she had fought desperately to survive. The attack had been brutal, sustained, and absolutely lethal. Death would have come within minutes as Mary bled out from her injuries. But who was she? At first, investigators didn't even know the victim's identity. Mary had been carrying identification, which allowed police to quickly determine her name, age, and hometown. Contact was made with her family in Minneapolis, delivering the devastating news that would shatter their lives. Mary Kay Schlais, the talented artist, the beloved daughter and sister, the young woman with so much promise, was dead, murdered by a stranger while hitchhiking to an art show. The Schlais family was destroyed by the news. Mary's parents, her siblings, including her younger brother Donald, her extended family, all of them struggled to comprehend how something like this could happen. Mary had simply been traveling to Chicago, pursuing her passion for art, doing something that thousands of young people did every day in 1974. And now she was gone, killed by a violent predator who had struck without warning and disappeared without a trace. The investigation began immediately, but from the start, it faced enormous challenges. What time is it where you're watching? Are you following this case late at night, just like the detectives who worked through those first dark hours, trying to make sense of Mary's senseless murder? Hit that like button if you believe hitchhiking should never have ended this way, and drop a comment. Did you or anyone you know hitchhike in the 1970s? It was a different time, a time when trust wasn't seen as dangerous. But for Mary, that trust cost her everything. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office, a small rural law enforcement agency serving a population of fewer than 30,000 people in 1974, suddenly found itself investigating one of the most brutal murders in the county's history. Sheriff's deputies, detectives, and investigators from the Wisconsin State Police converged on the crime scene in Springbrook Township, meticulously documenting every detail, collecting every piece of evidence, searching for any clue that might identify Mary's killer. The stocking cap found near Mary's body became the focal point of the investigation. It was a simple knitted winter hat, the kind worn by millions of people in cold climates. But it didn't belong to Mary, and it had apparently been left behind by the killer. Inside the cap, investigators found several strands of hair, human hair, that could potentially identify the person who had worn it. In 1974, DNA analysis didn't exist. The structure of DNA had been discovered in 1953 by Watson and Crick, but using it to solve crimes was still decades away. The first use of DNA in a criminal investigation wouldn't occur until 1986 in England. So in 1974, the best investigators could do with the hair samples was preserve them carefully, catalog them as evidence, and hope that someday, somehow, technology would advance enough to extract useful information from them. Beyond the stocking cap, the crime scene yielded frustratingly little evidence. There were no fingerprints on Mary's belongings or clothing. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual murder, only Denny Anderson, who had seen a man standing over what appeared to be a body, but who couldn't provide a detailed description beyond a man and a stare I'll never forget. There was no murder weapon. Miller had taken his knife with him when he fled. And there were no obvious suspects. Investigators began the painstaking process of trying to reconstruct Mary's final hours. They interviewed her family in Minneapolis, learning about her plans to hitchhike to Chicago for an art show. They canvassed the area where her body was found, knocking on doors of every home within miles, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on the night of February 14th or the morning of February 15th. They contacted law enforcement agencies along Highway 94 and other routes between Minneapolis and the crime scene, asking if anyone had reported seeing a young woman hitchhiking. The investigation generated leads, dozens of them. People called in tips. Motorists who had driven along Highway 94 that day came forward to report seeing a young woman with her thumb out. Other hitchhikers reported rides they'd gotten from drivers who seemed suspicious. Each lead was carefully investigated, each tip meticulously followed up, but none of them led to a credible suspect. One of the challenges was the transient nature of hitchhiking. The person who had picked up Mary could have been from anywhere, passing through Wisconsin on their way to somewhere else, someone with no connection to the area, someone who could blend back into anonymity the moment they crossed state lines. Without a description of the vehicle, without witnesses who could identify the driver, without any physical evidence linking a specific person to the crime, investigators were essentially searching for a ghost. The case consumed the Dunn County Sheriff's Office for months. Every available resource was dedicated to finding Mary's killer. But as winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, and no arrests were made, the investigation began to slow. Not because investigators gave up, but because they had exhausted every lead, interviewed every witness, and analyzed every piece of evidence using the technology available in 1974. By the one-year anniversary of Mary's murder, in February 1975, the case had gone cold. For Mary's family, the lack of answers was agonizing. Her brother, Donald Schlais, would later describe the emotional toll of living with an unsolved murder for decades. "It's just surreal," he told reporters in 2024, 50 years after Mary's death. "You don't expect it after all this time." The Schlais family held a funeral for Mary in Minneapolis, laying her body to rest in a local cemetery. They mourned. They grieved. They tried to move on with their lives. But the absence of justice, the not knowing who had killed Mary and why, created a wound that never fully healed. Mary's niece, Nina Mary Schlais, who would have been very young or not yet born when Mary was murdered, grew up hearing stories about the aunt she'd never known. Mary Schlais was more than a victim, Nina would say at Jon Miller's sentencing 50 years later. She was a brilliant, independent woman, a gifted artist, an equestrian, a world traveler, and a scholar. This case is a reminder that justice has no time limit. Throughout the late 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office periodically reviewed Mary's case. Every few years, a detective would pull out the file, reread the witness statements, re-examine the evidence, and look for any new angle that might have been missed. Each review ended the same way. No new leads, no new suspects, no progress. The stocking cap with the hair samples sat in the evidence room, carefully preserved, but seemingly useless without technology that could analyze it. Then, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that technology finally arrived. DNA analysis. But only as you remember, by the mid-1990s, DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal investigations. What had once seemed like science fiction, using microscopic genetic material to identify individuals, was now a reality. Law enforcement agencies across the United States began revisiting cold cases, submitting old evidence for DNA testing, in hopes of finally solving murders that had been unsolved for decades. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office submitted the hair samples from the stocking cap for DNA analysis. Scientists were able to extract a DNA profile from the hairs, a genetic fingerprint belonging to the person who had worn that cap. This was a major breakthrough. For the first time since 1974, investigators had a concrete lead: the DNA profile of Mary Kay Schlais's likely killer. The next step was to compare that DNA profile against databases to see if there was a match. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI, had been established in 1998. It contained DNA profiles from convicted criminals, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes. If Mary's killer had ever been arrested for another crime and had their DNA entered into CODIS, the system would find a match. Investigators submitted the DNA profile from the stocking cap to CODIS. No match. This was deeply frustrating. The DNA profile was clear and complete, but it didn't match anyone in the database. Either Mary's killer had never been arrested for another crime, or they'd committed their crimes before DNA collection became standard, or they'd somehow avoided the criminal justice system entirely. But the lack of a CODIS match didn't mean the DNA was useless. It just meant investigators would have to wait. Wait for the killer to be arrested for something else. Wait for new technology to emerge. Wait for a break that seemed increasingly unlikely as the years stretched into decades. In 2009, 35 years after Mary's murder, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office took an extraordinary step. They exhumed Mary's body. Advances in DNA technology had made it possible to extract genetic material from remains that had been buried for decades, and investigators wanted to ensure they had the best possible DNA evidence from the crime scene. The exhumation allowed forensic scientists to collect additional DNA samples and to compare them against new potential suspects. One of those suspects was Randall Woodfield, a former Green Bay Packers draft pick who had become known as the I-5 Killer, a serial murderer and rapist who had operated along Interstate 5 in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Woodfield had been convicted of multiple murders and was serving a life sentence in Oregon. His method of operation, attacking young women, often hitchhikers, seemed to match Mary's case. For a brief time, investigators hoped that Woodfield might be Mary's killer. DNA testing ruled him out. Woodfield's DNA didn't match the profile from the stocking cap. The case went cold again. By 2020, Mary Kay Schlais had been dead for 46 years. Her parents had long since passed away, never knowing who had killed their daughter. Her siblings were elderly. The original investigators had retired or died. The case file had been handed down through multiple generations of detectives, each one reading the same heartbreaking story of a talented young artist murdered by a stranger, each one hitting the same dead ends. And then, in the early 2020s, a new technology emerged that would finally crack the case. Forensic genetic genealogy. That would be used. Forensic genetic genealogy is a technique that combines DNA science with traditional genealogical research. Instead of waiting for a direct match in CODIS, investigators can upload a DNA profile to public genealogy databases, Sites like GED Match or Family Tree DNA, where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and find distant relatives. When an unknown suspect's DNA profile is uploaded to these databases, the system searches for people who share segments of DNA with the suspect, not exact matches, but genetic relatives. These could be third cousins, fourth cousins, or even more distant connections. By identifying these distant relatives and building extensive family trees, genealogists can work backward through generations to find common ancestors, then work forward through time to identify all the descendants of those ancestors, eventually narrowing down the pool of potential suspects. This technique had already solved several high-profile cold cases, most famously the Golden State Killer case in 2018, when Joseph James DeAngelo was identified and arrested after evading capture for decades. Sheriff Kevin Bigd, who took over leadership of the Dunn County Sheriff's Office in the 2000s, was determined to solve Mary Schlais' case. When he learned about forensic genetic genealogy, he immediately saw its potential. "I've been with this agency for 35 years, Sheriff Bigd would later say. And this case has been on the books all those 35 years. This is a huge victory for our agency." The problem was resources. Forensic genetic genealogy is expensive and time-consuming. It requires specialized expertise, access to genealogy databases, and hundreds of hours of research to build the family trees necessary to identify a suspect. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office, serving a rural county with a limited budget, didn't have the resources to conduct this kind of investigation on their own. That's when they reached out to Ramapo College of New Jersey. Ramapo College, located in Mahwah, New Jersey, has a unique program where students studying criminal justice and forensic science can work on real cold cases under the supervision of experienced genetic genealogists and law enforcement professionals. The program teaches students how to use DNA databases, how to build family trees, how to trace lineages back through generations, all skills that are critical to solving cold cases through genetic genealogy. When the Dunn County Sheriff's Office partnered with Ramapo College in the early 2020s, students took on Mary K. Schlais' case as a project. They were given the DNA profile from the stocking cap and tasked with identifying the person who had worn it, the person who had almost certainly murdered Mary 50 years earlier. The students uploaded the DNA profile to genealogy databases and began the painstaking process of building family trees. They identified distant relatives, people who shared small segments of DNA with the suspect. They traced those relatives back through generations, identifying common ancestors who lived in the 1800s or early 1900s. Then they worked forward through time, documenting every descendant of those ancestors, creating sprawling family trees that encompassed hundreds of individuals. This work took months. The students pored through birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, and family histories. They contacted potential relatives, asking questions about family lineages, trying to determine which branch of the family tree was most likely to contain the suspect. By late 2023, the students had identified a promising family line, but there was a problem. When they interviewed known members of that family line, none of them matched the suspect's DNA profile. Every male relative in the direct lineage was ruled out through either DNA testing or other investigative methods. This was a major setback. The students and investigators had been so close, and yet the suspect remained unidentified. Then someone had a critical insight. What if the suspect had been adopted? Adoption complicates genetic genealogy because adopted individuals often don't appear in the family trees of their biological relatives. If the suspect had been adopted as a child and raised by a different family, they wouldn't be listed in the genealogical records under their biological family's name. This would make them essentially invisible to the family tree research. The students refined their search, looking for adopted individuals who might fit the profile. They contacted more distant relatives, asking specifically about adoption in the family. And finally, in the fall of 2024, they identified a man who matched all the criteria. Jon Keith Miller, living in Owatonna, Minnesota. Miller had been adopted as a child. He was the right age to have committed the murder in 1974. He would have been in his mid-30s at the time. And most importantly, his biological family tree matched the DNA evidence from the stocking cap. To confirm their findings, investigators needed a direct DNA sample from Miller or a close relative. They contacted Miller's daughter, explaining the investigation and asking if she would consent to DNA testing. She agreed. The comparison was definitive. Miller's daughter shared a parent-child genetic relationship with the DNA from the stocking cap, which meant Jon Keith Miller was Mary Kay Schlais's killer. The DNA match was confirmed on November 4th, 2024, a date that would have been Mary Kay Schlais' 76th birthday. Sheriff Bigd immediately authorized Miller's arrest. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Do you think it's amazing that college students solved a case that professional investigators couldn't crack for 50 years? Hit that subscribe button if you believe in the power of education and determination to bring justice to victims like Mary. My facts. On Thursday, November 7th, 2024, law enforcement officers traveled to Owatonna, Minnesota, a small city about 65 miles south of Minneapolis. They arrived at the home of Jon Keith Miller, now 84 years old, a man who had lived his entire adult life free, despite having committed a brutal murder 50 years earlier. When Miller opened the door and saw the officers, investigators say he immediately knew why they were there. This wasn't a man caught by surprise. This was a man who had been carrying a secret for half a century, always knowing that someday, somehow, it might catch up with him. The officers explained to Miller that they had DNA evidence linking him to the 1974 murder of Mary Kay Schlais in Wisconsin. They asked if he would speak with them about the case. Miller's initial response was denial. He claimed he didn't know anything about Mary Kay Schlais or her murder. He insisted there must be some mistake. Then the investigators told him about the DNA evidence, about the stocking cap found at the crime scene, about the genealogy research that had traced his family tree, about his daughter's DNA confirming the parent-child relationship. And Jon Miller's denial crumbled. According to the criminal complaint filed in Dunn County Circuit Court, Miller admitted to picking up Mary Kay Schlais while she was hitchhiking. He admitted to propositioning her for sexual contact. He admitted that when she refused, he became enraged, grabbed a knife he had hidden in his car, and stabbed her in the back. Miller told investigators he stabbed Mary multiple times. He described pulling off the highway onto a rural road in Springbrook Township. He described trying to hide her body in a snowbank. And he described his panic when another car drove past and the driver stared at him. Denny Anderson, the witness who had never forgotten that face, that stare, that moment of seeing something terrible. Miller also admitted that the stocking cap found near Mary's body was his. He had left it behind in his haste to flee the scene. After giving his confession, Jon Keith Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was taken into custody at the Steele County Jail in Minnesota, awaiting extradition to Wisconsin to face trial. For Sheriff Kevin Bigd, the arrest was an overwhelming moment. I had a difficult time controlling my excitement, he told reporters. I've been with this agency for 35 years, and this case has been on the books all those 35 years. This is a huge victory for our agency. For Mary's family, the news was surreal. Donald Schlais, Mary's younger brother who had been in his teens when his sister was murdered, struggled to process the information. It's just surreal, he said. You don't expect it after all this time. Donald remembered his sister with love and pride. She had earned an art degree from the University of Minnesota and was in the process of applying to graduate school. She loved horses and horseback riding. She was talented, independent, and she had so much ahead of her. Now, 50 years after Mary's murder, her family finally knew who had killed her and why. But the question remained, would justice be served? Miller was 84 years old. Would he live long enough to stand trial? Would he be competent to participate in his own defense? And even if he was convicted, how many years could he realistically serve in prison at his advanced age? These questions would be answered in the months to come. Jon Keith Miller was extradited from Minnesota to Wisconsin to face murder charges in Dunn County Circuit Court. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, his own confession, the DNA evidence, the testimony from investigators, Miller's attorneys advised him that fighting the charges would be futile. On March 27, 2025, Jon Miller appeared in court and entered a plea of no contest to one count of first-degree murder in the death of Mary Kay Schlais. A no contest plea means the defendant doesn't admit guilt but doesn't contest the charges either. Legally, it has the same effect as a guilty plea for purposes of sentencing, but it allows the defendant to avoid explicitly admitting wrongdoing. The courtroom in Dunn County was filled with people who had waited decades for this moment. Members of the Schlais family, now elderly themselves, sat in the gallery. Law enforcement officers who had worked the case over the years attended to witness the resolution. Media representatives packed the room, documenting this historic moment, the sentencing of a man for a crime committed 50 years earlier. Mary's niece, Nina Mary Schlais, delivered a powerful victim impact statement. Mary Schlais was more than a victim, Nina told the court, her voice breaking with emotion. She was a brilliant, independent woman, a gifted artist, an equestrian, a world traveler, and a scholar. Nina addressed the court directly. This case is a reminder that justice has no time limit. To families still searching for the truth, let Mary's story be a testament that persistence, science, and dedication can bring long-awaited closure. The judge, after hearing the evidence and the impact statements, sentenced Jon Keith Miller to life in prison. Additionally, Miller was ordered to pay $2,200 in restitution to the Schlais family. At 84 years old, Miller would spend whatever time he had left behind bars, not in the free community where he'd lived for half a century, but in a prison cell, finally paying for the murder he committed in 1974. As Miller was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the Schlais family wept, not tears of joy, but tears of relief mixed with sorrow. Justice had finally been served, but it couldn't bring Mary back. It couldn't restore the 50 years they'd lived without her. It couldn't erase the pain of not knowing, of wondering, of hoping that someday the case would be solved. Sheriff Kevin Bigd spoke to reporters after the sentencing. This case shows that no matter how much time has passed, we will never stop seeking justice for victims. Mary Kay Schlais deserved better than what happened to her in 1974. Today, 50 years later, we've finally given her family the answers they've been waiting for. The role of the Ramapo College students in solving the case was widely praised. These young people, most of whom weren't even born when Mary was murdered, had used their education, their dedication, and cutting-edge technology to accomplish what professional investigators couldn't do for 5 decades. Their work demonstrated the power of forensic genetic genealogy and the importance of partnerships between law enforcement and academic institutions. Mary Kay Schlais' case raises profound questions about justice, memory, and the price we pay for violence in our society. For 50 years, Jon Keith Miller lived as a free man. He was a father, a grandfather, He had relationships, held jobs, participated in his community. While the Schlais family mourned, while investigators worked tirelessly to solve the case, while Mary's body lay in a cemetery in Minneapolis, Miller went about his daily life, carrying the secret of what he'd done. Did he feel guilt? Did he think about Mary? Did he worry that someday he'd be caught? We'll never know the full extent of Miller's inner life, his thoughts, his conscience. What we do know is that he killed a young woman in a moment of rage when she refused his sexual advances. And then he fled, leaving her body in the snow, like garbage. The fact that it took 50 years to solve Mary's case isn't unusual. There are over 250,000 unsolved murders in the United States. Many of these cases are decades old. Many will never be solved. Families live their entire lives without knowing who killed their loved ones or why. But Mary's case also demonstrates that unsolved doesn't mean unsolvable. Advances in technology, DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, forensic science are giving new life to cold cases that once seemed hopeless. Every year, dozens of cold cases are solved using techniques that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. The partnership between the Dunn County Sheriff's Office and Ramapo College is a model for how law enforcement can leverage academic resources to solve difficult cases. The students who worked on Mary's case learned invaluable skills, while also contributing to real-world justice. They gave a family answers. They helped catch a killer. And they demonstrated that dedication and modern science can overcome even the most stubborn cold cases. Donald Schlais, Mary's brother, expressed gratitude to everyone involved in solving the case. "I'm grateful to law enforcement and the forensic team for their efforts," he said. "As for what happens to Miller, that's beyond my control. I'm going to let God handle it. He'll take care of it. Miller will have to pay when he dies, too." This sentiment, letting go of the need for personal revenge and trusting in a higher justice, reflects the profound spiritual and emotional work that families of murder victims must do. For 50 years, the Schlais family carried the burden of not knowing. Now, with that burden lifted, they could finally grieve fully, remember Mary completely, and move forward with their lives. You got a day. Mary Catherine Schlais was born on November 4th, 1948. She died on February 15th, 1974, at the age of 25. In the years between her birth and her death, she accomplished more than many people accomplish in a full lifetime. She earned a degree in art from the University of Minnesota. She became an accomplished equestrian. She traveled. She created. She dreamed of attending graduate school in Chicago. Mary's life was stolen by a stranger who decided that his momentary sexual desire was more important than her right to live. Jon Keith Miller made a choice on that February day in 1974. A choice to proposition a young woman for sex. A choice to become enraged when she refused. A choice to grab a knife and stab her more than a dozen times. A choice to try to hide her body and flee the scene. That choice defined the rest of Miller's life, even if he tried to forget it, even if he tried to live as though it had never happened. And that choice defined the Schlais family's life, creating a wound that never fully healed, a question that haunted them for 50 years. But on November 7th, 2024, that question was finally answered. On March 27th, 2025, justice was finally served. Jon Keith Miller, at 84 years old, was sentenced to life in prison for a murder he committed when Mary Kay Schlais was just beginning to pursue her dreams. Mary's niece Nina said it best. "This case is a reminder that justice has no time limit." For every family still waiting for answers in an unsolved case, Mary's story offers hope. Science is advancing, investigators are persistent, and killers, no matter how long they hide, can eventually be found. If you made it to the end of this 50-year investigation with me, thank you for honoring Mary K. Schlais's memory. Hit that subscribe button for more cold case investigations. Like this video if you believe every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. Share this video to help spread awareness about the power of forensic genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from today? Do you have any connections to Wisconsin, Minnesota, or to the hitchhiking culture of the 1970s? Let's build a community dedicated to remembering victims and supporting families who are still searching for answers. Mary Catherine Schlais, born November 4th, 1948, died February 15th, 1974. Artist, equestrian, scholar. Daughter, sister, and a life stolen, a family shattered. Justice delayed for 50 years, but justice finally served. We remember Mary K. Schlais, and we will never stop fighting for victims, no matter how long it takes.